Hi, welcome to the first lecture of our course, Shakespeare and the History of the English Kings. This week, I want to give a bit of background information on William Shakespeare himself, as well as on the time period that he lived in. We'll also talk a bit about the sources that he used when writing what are known as his historical plays, and we'll talk about how accurate his plays actually are in comparison to those sources. But I really want to begin by highlighting why I think that this class is important in terms of how we view history and also in terms of what lessons we can take from it. And that's where I want to start. So, I can remember when I was sitting in history class in junior high and in high school, being handed one big textbook at the beginning of the year that weighed a ton, and it was almost always, scuffed and damaged from years of previous use. And it was a huge pain to carry it around all day, and this one textbook would cover a large period of time, a really large period of time, sometimes thousands of years. And major events such as the rise and fall of the Roman Empire or the American Revolution would all be condensed into one unit of 30 pages or so, or sometimes even just one chapter. And at least in my experience, you usually didn't get much more from such books than names and dates. They're very dry reading, very boring, or at least again, they seem that way to me, and they don't provide much of a connection between the history that they're telling and its relevance to our own lives. Those sorts of textbooks, and also, I guess we could say the history classes around which they're based, they take the human element out of the equation. Now, names and dates are fine, but if we just memorize a whole lot of them and then say that we know our history, we're missing out on one of the most important things that history as a subject has to offer us. These people that we read about, from ancient Greece all the way up to current events, are just that. They're people, with their own passions and hopes and dreams, their own fears and failings. They have their own unique ways of interacting with those around them and interacting with the world and with God. And when we study history from the point of view, as it were, of these people who lived that history out, two things happen, I think, that don't happen in the dry, methodical way of reading history that such gigantic textbooks usually typify. So one of those things is that it makes the history that we're reading about come alive in our imaginations. We can read about the War of the Roses or the Battle of Azincourt and find out who won, how many soldiers died, and so on. We can read all about that from Wikipedia if we wanted. But without being able to put a face to the names or personality to the names, we can't really be invested in those battles. And another thing that happens, the second thing that happens, is that we can recognize aspects of ourselves in those characters. That would be good aspects as well as bad aspects. We'll see the dangers that lie in having too much pride or of being too fearful or suspicious of others. And we'll also see what makes a good leader, what inspires others to follow those leaders and live good, godly lives. In other words, these lessons to be learned from history are very personal. And we can see that the figures we'll encounter deal with a lot of the same problems, concerns, and moral conundrums that we do today. So what all of this comes down to is this, that history should be read like a story to get the most out of it. And that's what Shakespeare's historical plays do, in a really fascinating, amazing way. And this shouldn't be surprising, because William Shakespeare is a great storyteller. He's widely regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, writers of English literature. If you've never seen or read one of his plays, then at least you've surely heard about them. Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, and so on. And I'm sure also that everyone's at least seen a portrait of him. There's actually a statue right over my shoulder, if you haven't. That's William Shakespeare himself. Back when I was first starting to lose my hair, I had longer hair, and I kind of looked like him a little bit. Somebody told me that I looked a bit like William Shakespeare. I just needed the goatee. But anyway, He was a very prolific writer. He wrote sonnets, narrative poems, and of course, many well known plays. And he wrote them on a schedule, too, which is even more impressive. He was the writer for a particular group of actors that he worked with, and London audiences in the Elizabethan era were always demanding fresh entertainment to watch. So this wasn't just a hobby, it was a job for him to be producing all of these great works of literature. He wasn't some writer off on some solitary plot of land like maybe Henry David Thoreau or William Wordsworth. If he didn't crank out a new play every few months or so, he didn't eat. So it's astonishing that the plays have so many layers and are so delicately crafted when one keeps in mind that he was writing on a rather hurried time frame. So, William Shakespeare was born in the year 1564 to John and Mary Shakespeare in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon. The Shakespeares were what we might call middle class. I think that's a fair label to put on them. John Shakespeare was an alderman and a glove maker, and Mary was descended from a lesser branch of the Ardens, which was a family of nobility. It's believed by some that both of his parents were illiterate, meaning that they couldn't read or write. Documents that have survived from that time showed that they signed their names with an X, which was the mark of that someone who couldn't read or write would put to important paperwork instead of just their names. William was educated at the local free grammar school, where he would have learned Latin from classical authors such as Virgil and Ovid, as well as Roman playwrights such as Plautus and Seneca. And it was probably expected that when he came of age, he would help his father in the glove-making business and eventually take that over entirely. The Shakespeares didn't have enough money to send William to college, and there isn't even any indication that he would have wanted to go anyway. His earliest exposure to the world of theater and acting, aside from the plays that he would have performed in Latin at the grammar school, were probably from the companies of traveling actors that would pass through town as they made the rounds of the countryside. Keep in mind that acting at the time wasn't considered a very reputable career, and this was for a number of reasons. In Protestant England, theater was associated with Catholicism, and we can talk about why later on. And these roaming companies of actors would oftentimes be arrested or at least forced to leave town. They weren't really welcomed, even though everybody secretly wanted to see a good play anyway. But there must have been something in the business that young William, found appealing. He left for London around 1592, leaving behind his parents and his own family to do so. He had married a woman named Anne Hathaway, who was older than himself, in 1582, 10 years earlier. And they had 3 children together by this time, too, Susanna and twins, Judith and Hamnet. And there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not Shakespeare had a happy marriage. After all, he left his family behind in Stratford, and it doesn't seem that he visited them all too often during his years in London. Some would argue that he was doing what he had to do to earn a living, and he certainly wouldn't be the first person to leave their family behind to do so. During the California Gold Rush, for example, in the 1800s, laborers came from as far away as China to strike it rich, and they would sometimes go for years without seeing their wives or their children, but they were always sending money that they earned back home in the meantime. So even though they weren't at home with their family, they were still supporting their family in their own way. And Shakespeare did the same thing. It would be unfair to say that he abandoned his family, but there's also enough evidence to suggest that he probably wasn't the dad or the husband of the year either. You can probably find all sorts of theories and movies based off of those theories, like Shakespeare in Love or Anonymous, that try to delve into the private life of Shakespeare. Speculation has always abounded about who he really was, what he was like at home, and these speculations have abounded largely because there's very little documentation that has actually survived to us through the years. It's funny, actually, that someone as prolific as Shakespeare kept so silent about his own experiences and struggles in writing. All we really have in his own hand are real estate transactions, financial documents, things like that. So while it is fun to let the imagination run wild sometimes, it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of what we think we know about Shakespeare's personal life is just guesswork. So anyway, Shakespeare came to London not as a writer, but as an actor first. And he came to London because that's where the theaters were. He would have rubbed shoulders with the big names of his day who were already well-established playwrights, such as Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and Thomas Nash. And we can see the influence of their works in Shakespeare's own, particularly in his earlier plays. The idea of intellectual property rights wasn't as prevalent back then as it is today, and it was fairly common to try to outdo one's competition by staging your own version of a play that they wrote. So many of Shakespeare's plays are either reworkings or retellings of earlier plays. And if not that, they're inspired by histories of medieval England, by chronicles of the land, or by the Greco-Roman world. But it was his ability to retell these older stories with new life and new significance that made him such an extremely popular writer. Now, the corpus of Shakespeare's plays can be divided into three categories, into tragedy, comedy, and history. And while all of the plays that we'll be studying in this class fall firmly into the history genre, that doesn't mean that there aren't elements of tragedy and comedy mixed into them as well. Our first play, Richard II, for example, could easily be classified as both. And so could our last play, Richard III. Throughout, we'll see characters who bring elements of comedy into the proceedings, such as Jack Falstaff and Ancient Pistol in the Henry IV plays. So there's a lot of overlap, and we usually tend to classify his plays into those three categories for our own sake, for our own understanding of them. But Shakespeare himself doesn't seem to have been too concerned about keeping the comedy out of the tragedy and vice versa. But these plays, the historical plays, they strive to be true to what actually happened, and so they limit the range of what Shakespeare can do within them, in a way that his tragedies and comedies don't. He doesn't have that problem there. He can feel free to make someone like Iago or Edmund as wicked and as evil as he wants in his tragedies. But in these plays, we'll see that the actions of even the most despicable characters do have some basis in historical fact, to a greater or lesser extent. Most of the plays we'll be reading are dramatizations of 2 or 3 different historians who were writing at the time. One influential source was Ralph Holinshed's Chronicles, which covered most of the events that we'll see taking place in the plays. Many portions of Holinshed's Chronicles are actually copied into speeches of different characters in the plays verbatim. Edward Hall was another contemporary historian. He was also a lawyer whose works Shakespeare used as a reference frequently. But there were also earlier dramatizations of many of these plays that Shakespeare likely would have known about as well and turned to for inspiration. I think it's also important when reading these plays to keep in mind how they were likely experienced by their original audiences. So the theater, to just kind of paint a brief mental image for you of what it would have been like, the theaters at the time had to be built in specific regions of the city that were pre-approved by what were essentially the city's councilmen. At a certain point in his career, Shakespeare and some of his fellow actors purchased land and built their own theater on it, called the Globe. And the Globe is essentially what the theaters of the time looked like. General admission ticket holders stood on the ground floor, so imagine standing for a 2-hour play, and if you had more money to spend, you could sit in the gallery and be a little bit more comfortable. The Globe was open-roofed, although not all theaters of the time were. So if you want a clearer picture of what it looked like, there's a smaller replica of it that's in London right now. And they put on performances of Shakespeare's plays regularly, and you can still go there and imagine that you're back in the 16th century. This isn't the original globe. That one burned down in 1613 during a performance of one of Shakespeare's last plays, Henry VIII. But the one there now is on the same spot, and even though it's not as big, it's a pretty good idea of what the original looked like. Now, during the time that Shakespeare was writing, there was a lot of political unrest. Politics were almost as important to Londoners then as they are to us today. Queen Elizabeth I, who had enjoyed really a tremendously long reign of 45 years, was getting old, and she had never married or had children, so questions were coming up as to who would be the heir. Now, this was eventually settled about midway through Shakespeare's career, when King James of Scotland would take the throne. But the majority of the plays we'll be reading in this class, actually I think all of them, were written during this time of uncertainty, just before Elizabeth's death. And I bring this up partly because it explains why Shakespeare was writing so many plays about the history of medieval England in the first place. Not only was it taboo, it could also be potentially fatal to write stories or plays about contemporary politics or political figures. More than one playwright was arrested and spent a night or two in the infamous Tower of London for putting on a play that was a bit too on the nose, to put it mildly. So playwrights who wanted political drama or historical tales, and they would want them because the Londoners, being obsessed with politics at the time, wanted political theater, these playwrights had to go to a remoter time where current politicians or noblemen weren't likely to be offended by what they saw on stage. Even with the medieval plays that Shakespeare does present, sometimes he had to change things, or he was questioned about what his motive in writing what he did actually was. In fact, the first play we'll read, Richard II, was staged on the night before an attempted coup by a nobleman named the Earl of Essex, and it was staged in order to rile up the people who saw it and get them to support the overthrow of the Queen. Now, we're pretty sure that Shakespeare wasn't in on the plot himself. All he knew was that the Earl had paid for the play to be performed, so he and his actors did the job. But Richard II is about the deposing of a king. And when Elizabeth heard about all of this, after Essex's rebellion was put down with relative ease, she said to her advisors, "Know ye not that I am Richard II?" She was able to grasp the comparison that was being drawn there by Essex. Drama informed politics and vice versa, to a tremendous degree in Shakespeare's time. So throughout this course, I'll also be highlighting major events of Shakespeare's own day that had a bearing on the plays we'll be reading, even though we'll mostly be talking about the time period that the plays cover. On that note, we'll cover major battles such as the Battle of Shrewsbury, the 100 Years' War between England and France, and the War of the Roses, which was a civil war that arose between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. So you're still getting names and dates of famous peoples and battles, only in this class, hopefully, those people and battles will be fleshed out through the storytelling. Before we close, I want to say a word about the language in these plays. It's no secret that Shakespeare's plays aren't easy reads. Not only does he use words and figures of speech that are out of date and therefore hard to understand for us, but he also uses words and figures of speech that were strange and hard to understand even back when he was writing. Shakespeare is someone who loved wordplay, who loved to take words that have multiple meanings and find out what the common element is between them and play off of that. It's also well known that he invented a good number of words when the ones available to him weren't really doing the trick in conveying the ideas that he wanted to express. Some of those words that he invented we still use today: laughable, amazement, assassin, premeditated. But others didn't stand the test of time so well. So don't be discouraged if you come across words or expressions that you don't know. Some editions of the plays have definitions of those words in the margins, and those are helpful if you have those. But if not, you can always look up the words in a dictionary if you can't make sense of the sentence without them. However, with that being said, I would encourage you not to pause every time you come across a strange word to go and look up the meaning. That's going to become really grueling, and especially in extended metaphors. You'll have to pause so many times that the overall meaning of the passage might escape you. This is mistaking the forest for the trees, right? Instead of reading a word, pausing, going to look it up, and then coming back, getting a few sentences, pausing again, so on and so forth. Instead of that, try to guess what the mystery word is through context clues. From the other words in a passage, sometimes you can make a good guess at what the mystery word generally means, at least enough to go on with an understanding of what you just read. And this will save you a lot of time. And really, it's also closer to what the experience would have been for Shakespeare's original audience. They were in a theater, they were watching these plays in real time, and they certainly wouldn't have had a dictionary to flip through rapidly while the show progressed in front of them. So, yeah, don't be afraid to just kind of skim over a word that you don't understand. Try to use context clues to understand it. That way, the reading will go a lot quicker. I'm speaking, from my own experience here. And this also leads me to my second bit of advice for reading Shakespeare, which is read the plays aloud. Remember that while we can read the plays as one would read a poem or a novel, and they're still great literature that way, they were originally intended to be seen. They were intended to be heard. Sometimes a passage that doesn't make sense when you're reading it becomes crystal clear when you hear it spoken. And this is something that happens for me a lot when I read Shakespeare. And you can also look up performances of the plays. There's usually at least one or two on YouTube, even if it's just an amateur production. And these will help you visualize what's happening and get a feel for what's being said. Maybe you've already seen a performance of a few of the plays, and drawing on your memories from that will probably be useful to you as well. And finally, remember that the actual William Shakespeare wasn't quite like what our modern understanding of who William Shakespeare was. People approach him and his plays as if they're always melodramatic, always formal, always stuffy. But it's important to note that sometimes he's just goofing around. His plays have rude jokes, nonsensical jokes, buffoonery, clowning around, and it's helpful to keep that in mind when it comes to understanding difficult passages. Because if you're reading a nonsense, goofy passage and trying to make sense of it as some solemn, poetical, deeply resonant thing, it's not going to make sense that way. So, that'll be it for the first lecture of this class. Next time, we'll look into the historical background of the events that happen in the plays themselves, and we'll see what characters featured prominently in the Middle Ages and how their actions set the stage for our first play, Richard II. Also, for next time, I'd like you to read Ben Jonson's Ode to Shakespeare, which was published after Shakespeare's death as a preface to the first folio, which was the collected edition of all of Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623. There will be a link to the ode on our class website, though most modern editions of Shakespeare's collected works also include the ode somewhere near the title page. So check and see if it's not there, if you have one of those. Otherwise, I'll have the ode available for you to read, and we'll talk about it next time. Thanks.